issues and questions. What is a constitution? What is the point of a constitution? A constitution has some very practical aspects to it. It says, this is how we're going to create the mechanisms by which we run our country or state or city, whatever the or organization, whatever the Constitution is for. But it is also something that defines what the group is and what the fundamental principles are. And my interest in constitutions doesn't only come from my civic interest in questions like civil rights and separation of church and state, but also professionally and academically, since I do international politics, comparative politics, international relations, I have started to look into different constitutions of different countries, and you find some very, very interesting things. This little thing is the Constitution of the United States that we've had since 1789. It's the second Constitution of the United States. The first one didn't work too well. Almost lost us the Revolutionary War. But this little pamphlet with all the amendments, etc., if you don't count the Declaration of Independence, which is also put in there, is 34 pages, but 34 very, very small pages. On the other hand, Constitution I've become somewhat familiar with. This book is the Constitution of Brazil. And it is a regular sized book, and it's got several hundred pages of articles and amendments and all sorts of stuff going on. It's over 200 pages long. And it tries to sort of micromanage everything. And I'm not going to lecture on the politics of Brazil, but constitutional issues in Brazil get extremely complicated and extremely hard to figure out, because for every article you think is on your side, there's another article that's very easily used by the other side. It's almost like the Bible. You can justify just about any position. You can find your quote, and you can find your passage, and you can determine anything. In a way, it gets very complicated. I have some other constitutions here. I'm not going to show them up. But among other things, it says what you're about. It says who you are. It defines you. And of course, one of the things that's very important in the American Constitution, and this was very controversial also. Don't think that this kind of went through unanimously. No mention of God, and specifically of a Christian basis for the country. And that was understood and deliberate, and that should not be mistaken for evidence that most of the founders were not religious. Most of the founders were very religious, but most of the founders were also very concerned with, among many other things, religious liberty. And therefore, they said, this isn't God's document, this is a human document, and we know the difference. We're creating this for a certain purpose. In the, whoops, there we go. The Constitution, as I said, says how we're going to govern ourselves, how difficult decisions are going to be decided. But again, it shouldn't decide every last little thing. If you create a Congress, you create a Congress to make decisions on regular statutes, laws, policies, etc. Your policies, your specific laws, your traffic laws shouldn't be in the Constitution. That has no place in the Constitution. The Constitution is a set of fundamental laws. And that's what it should be, and that's all that it should be. It would include principles, it would include other things, but it shouldn't be more than that. And when it is, as I have tried to point out in the case of Brazil, and Brazil's not the only country with this problem, you get a mess. It doesn't function the way it should. Constitutions, as we understand them, they are a modern idea. Constitutions started with us. Actually, the British would say with them, and they claim that they have a constitution, they have the first modern constitution, and you sort of have to say, yes, they do, but their constitution isn't a booklet like this or a book like this. If you actually took their written constitution as such, it would fill building, 5 or 6 stories high with several rooms this large on each floor. They don't have a written constitution as such, but, well, you got to be nice and let them say that they have a constitution. But the idea is a modern idea. And the idea comes from what we would call classical liberalism. Classical liberalism is the political ideology of capitalism. And it all rose and developed over a couple of hundred years, but started to take the form that we know it in the 1700s. The idea of a constitution embodies the two most important and fundamental ideas of classical liberalism. There should be limits on what the government can say about commercial and economic affairs, and there should be limits on what the government can say about personal affairs. The government is the king, back then, in most cases, and the government also included the church. It was assumed in almost every country that there was an official church of the country. That's just the way it was. And this doesn't say anything about whether there should or shouldn't be. This just says there should be limits on what the government and the church should be able to say about commercial affairs and about personal affairs. By limits, it doesn't mean no limits or narrow limits. It just means defined limits. Up until there were constitutions, the king could do whatever he wanted. He could stop trading with that country over there because they didn't send somebody to his daughter's wedding. Or he could say, off with your head. There were no limits. A constitution says these are the rules. The king can do this, this, and this, but he can't do this, this, and this, or he can't do this, this, and this unless the parliament says it's okay, etc. But that's what a constitution is. It puts those limits on. It defines the relationship between individuals and the state. This is why the Constitution is so important for civil rights. They have to be defined. Your civil rights, in this context, are the rights that you have in your society, and they should be guaranteed by the Constitution. Changing our Constitution, the national Constitution has rules that are fairly straightforward. In Article 5, if 2/3 of both houses of Congress want to propose an amendment, then they propose the amendment, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of all the state legislatures. It's pretty straightforward. There are other possibilities. You could have the states decide. If 2/3 of the states decide there should be a constitutional amendment, they can propose it, and it still has to be decided then by 3/4 of all the states. That's the mechanism. That's the national mechanism.